Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking about Forthright Open Roleplay. And today what I'm going to talk about specifically is harm within the game. So harm it would be called damage in almost any other tabletop role-playing game. So harm is when your character is successful in combat and does something to bring down the health of either a non-player character or a vehicle or a building. Okay, now harm takes away luck. So within Forthright Open Roleplay, they have a mixture. Luck is kind of a mixture of your defensive abilities and your armor, and a little bit of luck in there as well. It's pretty interesting. I like the way that it works for buildings and for vehicles as well. But so essentially, like, let's say your character has 12 harm. When you take 13 harm, you are unconscious, right? Actually, I think you're unconscious the moment you go to 0, and then beyond, and then down from that. Now that brings up a question about death. Okay, so death within the Forthright Open Role-Playing game, it's a little odd. So your protagonist, by the way, the player characters in this game are called protagonists, and the game master is called the guide. Okay, you know what? Let me talk about death a little later. Let me get all the way through on harm, and then we'll talk about death at the end there. So, so essentially, you're going to use weapons. You're going to use martial arts tactics, all kinds of things to do harm to the non-player characters. Your protagonist will do that, right? Now, essentially, and also those things will be done to you, right? Now, I actually really like the way that the entire health system is pretty elegant. It's actually really elegant. It's really well done. It's easy to understand. So you have luck. When you've received enough harm to take your luck to 0, then you're going to go into, you're specifically going to go into injuries, okay? And injuries, so basically at that point, the guide will actually work with you to apply a distinct injury to your character. So let's say that somebody hits you with a small axe, takes a big chunk out of your arm, okay, and that takes you down to I think it triggers when you're like at quarter or even half of your harm. You could take an injury. You know what? I'm sorry. I think you take an injury as soon as you get to 0. And then if you take an injury, you're not knocked out, right? So let's say somebody takes a notch out of your arm with an axe, okay? And so at that point, you're gonna hit that 0, right? But then rather than being knocked out, right, you can then take an injury, right? So basically, let's say it's to your right arm, which is your weapon arm. What the guide would say is you have an injury to your right arm, right? A laceration to your right arm. The laceration is not really mechanical, but what is mechanical is they'll say, from now on, all weapon checks with your right arm are dropped, okay? Now, let's talk about the difficulty checks within Forthright Open Roleplay. Really, really elegant system. So, setback, exchange, win, and boon, okay? You roll a d20, you add your bonus. If you're 7 or below, you have a setback, which is a failure with trouble. If you get an exchange, which is 8 to 13, you get a, specifically in that circumstance, you get a success with trouble. From 14 to 20, you get a win, which is a success with no trouble. And then a boon is success and a special advantage, which gives you a boon, which is a currency in the game that you can use to do a whole lot of things, right? Which is nice. It's a good mechanic. So when your arm has been, knocked off with that, or actually when you have a deep laceration on your arm, you're gonna have dropped checks, right? Well, what that means is that if you roll a win with your arm, right, you're gonna have a drop check, which means that goes back to setback. So you got a success with trouble rather than a success with no trouble now. And if you rolled a setback, right, if you rolled an exchange, now you're all the way down in failure, which it's rough. Like, it's pretty rough. So so it's a pretty interesting aspect of the game, and the injuries part is really straightforward. I really like it. It gives some functionality, you know, it gives some grittiness to wounds that is really pretty cool. And then, but I also wanted to say, it goes even further, right? Now, the drop check that I just talked about, that's a weakness. Injuries actually come in two types. They come in injury as a weakness or injury as a vulnerability, okay? And vulnerabilities, if you get an injury which is a vulnerability, that will give you specifically a hindrance, right? So hindrances might be blinded or mute or exhausted, right? These are all kind of hindrances. But weaknesses are specifically dropped checks, right? And so, you know, so all the, and in both cases, those vulnerabilities and those weaknesses are limited in scope. And so you work with the guide to say, okay, I have this injury and I'm gonna have lower performance in this band of functionality, which is it's pretty cool. It's really well done. I really like the way they handled our arm in here. Now, one of the things that is also really interesting is the game has these things called boosts. And boosts are ways that you can make anything better. Ways you can make your protagonist better, ways you can make a vehicle better, ways you can make a structure better, ways you can make a weapon better, right? It's an aspect of the game where you add things. Well, in the game, recovery is actually managed through boosts, right? So you pay for them, almost the way you would pay for gear or the way you would pay for, the way you would purchase something, which is really, one of these, the more and more I'm reading into Forthright Open Roleplay, it really does have a lot of its own ideas and circumstances, and the way everything is melded, it really is its own unique game. And its combat system is really, it's meshed together well. I was pretty impressed with it overall. I do want to talk about death now, okay? Death is something I really don't like in Forthright Open Roleplay. And it's gonna open up a little bit of a bigger conversation. So let's talk about it, okay? All right, how to say that? Okay, yeah. All right, let's get into it. So when you, oh man, it's really crazy. All right, so death on both sides of the table is pretty weird in Forthright Open Roleplay. So your protagonist only dies if you and the game and the guide agree that your character dies. And you're like, what? Like, yeah, I found that very odd. And so the reason why I find it odd is because that, that kind of outlook on, and I'll go a little further on it, okay? The same thing happens for all non-player characters, right? So when you drop a non-player character, when you drop a goblin, if you take a short sword and you hit a goblin and you do 6 harm and they have 4 harm and now they're at -2 harm, right? In D&D, there wouldn't be any conversation about this. That goblin's dead, right? Like that's just the way it is. But in Forthright Open Roleplay, you always have the possibility of choosing if you killed a non-player character or if you knocked them out, right? Which that's a kind of mechanic I would really expect to see in like a game for children, and it literally is in 2 games for children that I've seen. It's virtually the same mechanic for both protagonist death and NPC death. The mechanic for it is similar to what I've seen in Hero Kids and No Time for Evil, both of which are children's games, which is really odd. Now, I don't have any problem with going down that road, but it seems really out of place in a game. I do have a problem with it in a game like this where combat matters, right? If you're if you're taking a lot of time to structure a strong combat system, and then you're deciding whether your protagonist died or not, and every single time you drop a goblin, you need to have a philosophical debate with yourself and the rest of the table about whether that goblin died, it's really, really odd. So I'm hoping this gets changed in a future edition of the game. I thought it was really strange. It opens up, and I'm going to echo something I said a little earlier. This game really it has a particular slant in the way it addresses no less than a dozen topics within the game, which when you're looking at it, and I don't think this is the case, but it looks this way. So these rule sets, it looks like they were created by someone who lives in Maine, who drives a Volvo, who has solar panels on their house and volunteers at a rescue shelter. Okay, they're really, really distinct, right? And I feel like, you know, if you were a person who owned a Ford F-150 and had a hunting dog, you'd be like, what? You know, and it's pervasive throughout the game. There's just this tone with a lot of the rules that are just, you're like, where did this come from? How did it get in here? And so, Forthright Open Role-Playing Game is a fantastic game. You can get it for free. You don't have to buy it. You can try it out before you buy it. And not just a subset of the rules, the entire rule set, right? Which is, and the PDF for it is fantastic. It really is an awesome game. So that death thing, you know, and actually, anytime this game is 190 pages long. Anytime you write hundreds of pages of content, there's going to be some things that are strange. Also, we have that issue of the bug feature, right? So I just talked about this death issue, right? And the death on the non-player character and the protagonist side, that could be a bug feature, right? So in the information technology world, whenever you have a defect, you know, your tester is going to say, you have a defect, you have a bug, and your developer's going to say, you have a feature, right? So that issue of, you know, like these really very strangely written rules it does come up like once a chapter, right? You're like, wait, what? You know, like, am I listening to an Ivy League professor talk? It's strange. But overall, there are spikes in the content. It's not all of the content. And it certainly isn't enough to disrupt the flow of the game overall and the value of the game overall, which I think the more I read, I really feel that Forthright Open Role-Playing Game is an aggressive competitor for both Fate and Cypher for best universal role-playing game system on the market right now, which is really interesting, very, very interesting. So that's my take on specifically on harm and what happens after, what the consequences of combat within Forthright Open Roleplay. Take care.